You're listening to Manufactured with Kim van der Weert
and Jessie Lee, a podcast about sustainability and the making of fashion.
Join us every week in conversation with the people who manufacture what we wear. Welcome, Manufactured listeners. This week, we're chatting to Ellen Saville and Kelly Phenicie from Green Design Link and the Endery. Green Design Link is based in Peru, and historically, they've produced for other brands. However, they recently decided to start their own in-house brand called the Endery.
Green Design Link support a community of over 1,000 knitters. Knitters aren't directly employed by Green Design Link. Instead, Green Design Link works with a network of small business leaders who directly manage the relationship with knitters. In this week's episode, we chat about why Green Design Link decided to create its own in-house brand. To our surprise, the reason for this transition was deadstock and pre-consumer waste. We explored the barriers manufacturers face in selling directly to end consumers and what positioned Green Design Link to make this leap.
Kelly and Ellen share quite a bit of detail about how the relationship between Green Design Link and its knitters is structured, how the risk and reward is distributed, and the kind of relationship they've managed to establish.
Inevitably, this takes us into social compliance. We look at the tension between mainstream models for social compliance and how these do or don't fit within Green Design Link's production model. And what are the implications for thinking about how we might integrate the artisanal production into more conventional fashion supply chains?
If you're on Instagram, please follow us to help us grow the conversation at manufactured_podcast. Or sign up on our website, www.manufacturedpodcast.com, to receive our news and updates. And finally, please don't forget to leave us a rating on iTunes and hit subscribe. Welcome, Kelly and Ellen. I want to start by having each of you just paint a picture of who you are, where you're from.
So first off, thank you so much for having us here. We're so pleased. We love talking about manufacturing with like-minded people, and I feel like it's something that's so in the background still. So it's really lovely to be able to kind of share our experience of what kind of goes on behind the making of clothing. In terms of where I come from and how I started, I actually grew up between Oklahoma, England, and Texas. Then I went to college in New York and just felt like I really still had so much learning to do, and I really wanted to be, after, traveling around in Europe, with my family, mostly on tours, I really wanted to be more on the ground in the culture in countries and really understand the societies on a deeper level. So I decided to, go to Latin America and just kind of backpacked around here and came to Peru and stayed on for a while. And, a few months just led to a few more months and a few more months, and eventually started building a life here. And, manufacturing just kind of fell into it, to be honest. Like after doing a lot with social justice and human rights, really having a passion for that, I got to a point where researching became really difficult and not being able to do action. So eventually I stumbled into, hand knitting and, artisan work and, business. And it just became such a really beautiful way to be able to combine different interests and really make an impact.
I think it's something I know. One of the things that led me into this space is sort of similar to you, which is like, well, maybe it's similar, but I felt like I had a background in human rights work as well. And I felt like in my day job, which was a more strictly human rights type of job, I was doing interesting and important work. But then in terms of my day-to-day participation in the consumer economy, I was undermining a lot of the work that I was aspiring to kind of fix. And yeah, I think that a lot of times we kind of separate human rights work or social justice work from the global economy. And in fact, it's impossible. They're so intertwined and intersected.
That, and, I feel like giving people work is really one of the most empowering things you can do. Being able to create a job for somebody, especially in the area that we're in with home workers, oftentimes women who don't have as much access to education and work opportunity, it's really incredible to be able to give them an opportunity to thrive. And it's not always easy. What we do, I mean, manufacturing in itself, as you know, is like not easy at all. But being able to build them up as small business owners, and a lot of the people that we work with, even didn't feel like they could have a bank account, things like that. But we've been able to formalize a really informal sector. And I think there's a lot of power to have that economic income and, leave a relationship if they want to leave and not have to be dependent on, the man of the house.
Yeah, it just reminds me a not pleasant, but definitely a convincing case. China started the economic reform in 1990s. And actually in 1990, I think China is one of the countries with highest suicide rate in the world. Before the economic reform, for a while, that suicide rate of Chinese women is very high in China. It's much higher actually than men. And that is very abnormal. Worldwide is usually the men's suicide rate higher than the women's, but in China it's the opposite. However, since 1990s, China started economic reform. Women started to have more and more opportunities to find jobs in factories or companies in smaller towns, bigger towns or cities, or even capital cities. That really guaranteed them a finance independence and opportunities to live a free life away from their maybe violent husbands or a very depressed daily life.
Oh, Jessie, that's so interesting. I didn't know that about the suicide rates for Chinese women prior to economic reforms versus afterwards. For listeners who are interested in learning more, we'll provide some links in the show notes. And what about you, Ellen?
Yes. So similar to Kelly, I've also traveled a lot. So I kind of grew up in the UK, but after university, I've traveled and worked extensively. I lived in Japan for a few years. I taught English. And that was often just kind of a way for me to just get out and see the world. I've always been really passionate about travel and about understanding different cultures. And I've always been a big maker. So I've always sewn, I've always upcycled, I've always been really into secondhand clothing. And just through all the travel, really, I've been able to access and work with artisan groups, learning more about textile traditions, which I did in Japan. I actually spent a bit of time in Cambodia as well, which was where I had my kind of aha moment with seeing factories, the overspill of factories and kind of the mass-produced clothing there. That was when I really started to understand kind of overseas production and thinking of the impact that must have on those people. So yes, and so found myself actually did a fellowship for a brand in Central America. That was my first experience of working with Latin American textiles, and I just fell in love with it. And I knew that Peru had an awful lot to offer in terms of fibers, in terms of textile traditions. I'd heard that it's just an incredibly old country historically. So it's a really amazing country to kind of get your teeth into. And if you've spent time in like Japan or any of these really, really old cultures, then there's just so much to learn. And Peru didn't really disappoint. It was just amazing from the word go. And I was able to kind of work with different groups and really try to understand the textile traditions and the culture that came along with that, because obviously in Peru, there's just such different landscapes. You've got the high mountains, the coast, and a lot of these different communities produce different textiles depending on where they are and what fibers they have to hand. So really fell in love with the weaving, and then came to knitting a little bit later, just kind of found myself in knitting, really. The same as Kelly. And it's a bit of a creative paradise, Peru, just because the artisans have such a high level of skill and they can pretty much make anything. So, and that like twinned with the kind of romance that comes with, the backstrap weaving and the knitting and the history and the yarn culture. I lived there for about 5 years, which is where obviously I met Kelly, and I started working with GDL. And then, last year we launched the Endery.
And how did Green Design Link, which is actually a manufacturer, end up switching over into an entity that is selling directly to end consumers?
The Endery is the in-house brand of Green Design Link. And this brand was specifically developed to tackle the waste issue in terms of the dead stock that we see piling up at the end of the production process. And this is not only just within our own remit, this is also, countrywide. I have a very close relationship with the alpaca mills in Peru. We both do. And so we're obviously able to access other larger kind of sources of dead stock as well. So we wanted the brand to use only dead stock materials in high-end fibers because there's so many of them in Peru. And the idea is that we develop small collections based around fibers that we find and that we love and that speak to us. So it's a very kind of waste-led design process, which was very challenging. So a lot of the time I would look at the reds and I would think, I really don't like that red, or I really don't like that green. And how is that going to look good together? How do we break that up? And that's why we ended up using a lot of stripes and a lot of intarsia designs, just because this allowed us to have fun. And we thought, if we're just going to go for it, we might as well just go for it, because we can't do really subtle nuisance, knitwear. And a lot of people are doing a fantastic job of that. But often it's not the neutral colors that are left over anyway. It's often, the ends of, colors that were last season's colors. We have to combine them in an interesting way for them to look good. And we're still testing the water and trying to get used to that. But it's been really, really fun, but it's also just been a very different way to approach design.
When you're not kind of behind the curtain and seeing it happen in action, it's really hard to envision how it does. But just any sort of like mistake, something that came out wrong, a miscalculation, there's just a lot of reasons why certain materials can start to build up. And as we started to see it build up, with our own work, we started to realize that like, this is an issue. This is an issue not only with us, this is an issue with everybody. And we started thinking, why not be creative about this? Because, I think a lot of people just take it as a problem, but, and it is kind of a problem because then it's also like the inventory and accounting and reporting it and storing it. And really trying to think, both of us, being from kind of like the target markets, so to speak, American, British, I think we really got the market. And as consumers ourselves, like we grew up in these countries, we buy from, brands that we idolize. We thought that this could be pitched in a really interesting way and that it could be really converted into something really beautiful.
So just talking about the brand and, the leftovers that we've been tackling as part of the brand, I think it's also important to mention about how we envision the brand as being a sourcing platform. Ideally, that's the direction we would love to go in, whereby, there are a lot of other brands out there that are looking to use leftovers and dead stock materials, and that, twinned with the kind of suppliers that we work with through GDL, we could be able to build out some really lovely collaborations and, kind of scale up what we're doing with the dead stock issue in Peru. That's the kind of the idea with setting up the Endery. And we're really keen to kind of, join forces with other brands that are also committed to tackling waste and using materials in an innovative and different way. We're still very new in that mission and still learning a lot. And we have, it's also worth mentioning the amazing team that we have behind us. And Kelly and I, obviously the people that face our audience and our customers, but there are some incredible people that help us source the dead stock, categorize it, find a home for it, understand what we have so that we can start to build collections out of that. And that's often the most difficult part, is just kind of understanding what there is out there and how we can offer that to different clients. And it's still a work in progress, but I think it's worth mentioning that we see there's a huge demand for people that want to use these types of materials, and the Endery is a part of that.
So I think it's important to explain here for listeners what exactly we mean by waste, because it's maybe not the kind of trash you imagine.
Yeah, actually, just remember, I once saw a big roll of fabric. It looks really nice. However, it's kind of waste. Why? Because by mistake, there is an extra line printed in the middle of the pattern. But this is a mistake of printing pattern. If we talk about quality, it's perfect, and it has nothing to prevent end consumers to enjoy it. So it's really a pity.
Yeah, sometimes rolls will even have, like when we would do incoming goods inspection, we would inspect the incoming rolls of fabric arriving, at our factory from China, and maybe they'd have a very small imperfection, and we would disqualify it for use, or stuff like the shades of the color were not exactly the same. So within, one run, it would have been quite noticeable, and we couldn't have used, a shade of green black with a rich black, but for other production, it would have been totally fine. So when we talk about waste, it can be whole rolls of fabric, which are perfectly suitable for use. It can also be offcuts. So after cutting, we have these scraps of fabric that are left between the pattern panels. And in fact, it's actually quite valuable because pre-consumer waste at the factory level has a composition passport. We know exactly what it is. It doesn't have any trims or accessories attached to it. So I expected Green Design Link to say that the reason they created the Endery was because they wanted a bigger piece of the pie. And by that, I don't mean greed or anything like that, but I just mean if manufacturers sell directly to end consumers, then they take home more of the revenue. It's interesting to hear that actually the reason didn't really have anything to do with that. It had everything to do with waste. And I think it's really interesting how you can turn this idea of waste and something that Green Design Link has really easily accessible to it into a resource that is something of value. And I think it kind of begs the question, how as manufacturers could we reimagine things and resources that are right in front of us, that are maybe often overlooked or typically perceived as worthless? About 6 months ago, I was talking to an organization called Reverse Resources, which is an organization that's trying to create an online platform for selling and trading of scrap. So, pre-consumer waste. They're trying to connect the people who have these resources to the people who want them. And it was interesting because I was chatting to someone who works for, or who was involved in Reverse Resources. And she said that they had a really hard time sometimes getting suppliers to get on board with the idea because suppliers feared that if they were to sell their waste and their scraps and their remnant fabric and their dead stock on a platform like this, that then brands would know exactly what their scrap rates are and what their would have more detailed information about their costs, and that then as a result that this would be used against them to squeeze their margins even further, so that then their customers, the brands, would come back to them during negotiations and say, hey, we saw you were selling like X number of kilos of our fabric on this platform, so we think you can do better than that, and we want you to reduce your price. Or even like, we saw you're selling these scraps and that's a new revenue stream for you, so therefore like you need to pass that on to us.
Yeah, it's complicated.
I think suppliers have a role to play in this in terms of, I think, seeing the opportunity instead of only seeing the risk and the fear. But at the same time, I think brands do too, which actually I think takes me to another point. One of the reasons Green Design Link is able to make this switch, and that Kelly and Ellen, that you saw the value of this waste, is because you also, as someone who is British or American, understand the market and how the market is evolving, which makes me think about emerging markets and in these countries that maybe weren't historically seen as fashion consuming countries, but now have emerging middle classes and are quickly becoming fashion consuming countries. Will manufacturers have an easier time selling to end consumers and making this switch?
Oh, I think definitely yes. And your words just remind me of a funny example I had when I worked for this French group. So I was in Shanghai, and our suppliers are mostly in Zhejiang province, and which is a very rich area around Shanghai. But I believe in other provinces, the situation would be the same. So anyway, at that moment, French buyers often send us some designs, ask us to source the suppliers to make it. And we will discuss about designs. For us, it's a bit shocking, as all these women top usually show lots of skins of the chest. In China culture, this is quite bold. So we were talking about those styles, and we were saying, those kind of styles would never be able to be a good sale in China. So that's very funny. Yeah, that makes me think actually for Chinese garment manufacturers, they were in China. They know quite well what Chinese girls or what Chinese men or women, what they would like to wear. They knew it because it's in the culture. And they also know very well about the market. For instance, if they needed to set up a shop, they know which road or which corner or which section, which crossroad is the best place to set up a shop. So these are the two advantages they have compared to the overseas buyers. And another advantage they have is they have the advantage of a more optimized way of production, which they get trained or get installed by working with overseas brands. So with all these advantages, I think, you just mentioned a very good point that in emerging markets, those manufacturers actually has an easier time to sell to end consumers.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I totally agree with so many of the examples you just described. I guess one of the questions I have in my head, which is maybe even one level bigger, is how do trends get set? And what drives what consumers want? If you look at it historically, that was the role of the designer, right? The role of the designer was to tell consumers what they wanted and what they should buy.
Yeah.
And now you also, I think at the same time, you have these emerging markets, but then sort of in parallel, you have this a flipping of the narrative about the role of the designer. And that instead of consumer trends being driven top down, that with the rise of fast fashion and ability to get products to market a lot quicker, that now actually what we see happening is consumers sort of setting the trends from the bottom up. And I don't know, I think it's an interesting...
Yeah, it's an interesting path. It's an interesting approach for the manufacturers to rebalance the whole power thing and to approach to the end consumers, because they do have some advantages.
But then imagine if all the consumers in emerging markets start consuming as many clothes as, say, Americans. I mean, from a sustainability perspective, that would be terrible. But
we're not encouraging everyone to consume as many clothes as Americans or as other, countries.
Yeah, definitely not. But
no.
But it is. But it's interesting, right? Because it's okay, we definitely don't want to support the overconsumption model. On the other hand, if we're talking about, say, workers' rights and giving manufacturers a bigger slice of the pie so that they can also pay their workers more, this actually, from that angle, might be a good thing. So I think that's maybe the point to take away too, is how sustainability can have so many different meanings and you can justify a lot of different courses of action based on the angle that you look at it from. And that a lot of times the different sort of angles for thinking about sustainability can be in tension and in conflict with one another. And that's why I think conversation across the supply chain between brands, between manufacturers, between all these different layers is so important for being able to think about these issues holistically and to find a path forward that really sort of hits the most angles that we possibly can. So I want to backtrack a minute. Can you just give us some context for what's Green Design Link and what is its relationship to the Endery?
Sure. Green Design Link is basically a manufacturer, like a factory, but instead of doing t-shirts or jeans, we're basically doing mostly hand knit garments on a large scale through a wide network of super skilled knitters here in Peru. So we basically produce really specialized quality knitwear for clothing brands. Really, I think we speak to, and who we are, is a brand that really seeks to empower artisans and really lift up craft as a beautiful thing and as something that has a lot of added value. And this is the kind of brand that we tend to attract.
It sounds like a Green Design Link is producing something highly specialized that not much producers can do in the market. Because of the product is highly specialized, either in terms of technique, either in terms of You see, handmade and machine-made are totally two different concepts. If it's handmade, your tolerance naturally is much higher than machine-made because you cannot use the same quality standard or the same tolerance standard. I would call it like the characters of the products. So because of the characters or the natures of the products, the brands are very different, I guess. I imagine this group of brands have much higher tolerance in terms of technical specifications, in terms of prices, in terms of delivery date, and gives much more spaces to the manufacturers for communication and for trust. So this is very interesting. Seems it's all related to what we produce today. What a manufacturer produce can actually increase their spaces in terms of negotiation and in terms of trust, in terms of sort of partnership.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the themes that's been coming up a lot in some of our conversations is and something that I had never really considered before undertaking this project is just how the nature of the product and what kind of product you're producing affects sort of, let's say, the balance of power at the negotiating table. And more technical products and products that are harder to make, which maybe fewer people are willing to take on, actually kind of has the potential to balance the scales a little bit at the negotiating table and to make the relationship, I think, between the brand and the manufacturer quite different than in, say, cases where what you're making is a standard T-shirt, which anybody can make.
A handmade product, it means you have to, set up or build a strong relationship with the people, with the doers, with people who actually do it. Because it's handmade, you truly rely on them. It's not like traditional manufacturing. It's machines and people. So somehow I feel in traditional way of manufacturing, machines are the major players here. You can always train the operators to get used to master the machines. So I have a feeling that somehow traditional manufacturing gives more attention or more importance to machines instead of operators. Doesn't mean they don't respect operators, they do. But somehow machines also play a very important role, especially for some other complicated woven products, for instance, like jeans. I'm curious to know what kind of connections or how they grow the trust between them and the knitters. That's also quite interesting, yeah.
I think, building trust, volume. I mean, what I told you guys before in terms of the way that we've been able to consistently bring them more and more orders. So we started really as kind of like a winter focused brand. Of course, knitwear, hand knits often is very, winter accessory oriented, knit scarves, knit sweaters. And then when we were able to get more into, spring and summer and make it year round, then, that was huge for everybody because the work was a lot more stable. It wasn't just seasonal. The way that they've seen us grow. And I think also, the way that we've been able to work with them and really listen to them and try to be great partners. I'm sure there's a lot that we have to improve on, but we do try to be the best partners we can with these people and really respect their say and the ways that they want to grow.
I want to ask, if it's all right with you, just a little bit of details on this, because I think trust often, I've talked to a lot of people who work within brands even, who are like, yeah, trust, we want more open communication with our suppliers, but how do we actually get that? And it feels like such an abstract and nebulous concept. I mean, you've described sort of what this relationship between Green Design Link and knitters, sort of the feeling that it has and the way that information flows more easily both ways. But I want to ask you to share some of the details about how that relationship is actually structured, because what I understand is that you have Green Design Link and then you work with a number of production leaders who then work with various knitting communities. Is that accurate or not?
Yes.
And so the knitters are sort of like is cooperative kind of the right word, that it's a network of cooperatives who are sort of feeding products in. The role of Green Design Link is basically sort of fielding out these orders and then making sure that there's technical ability and to produce the products, and then doing quality control before they get pushed back out to the customer? Or how does that work?
Yeah, that's basically it. So it's not, I wouldn't call it exactly a cooperative. At least here in Peru, that has kind of a legal structure. It's a different legal structure usually to what we're working with. So oftentimes there will be a knitting leader who will be the one who is essentially the business owner. And the smallest business form, basically, let's say, I guess it would be something similar to maybe like a little mini LLC in their name. We're working with that little LLC and they're responsible for manning their group. And what we do as Green Design Link is we, obviously manage all communications with the client. We do like the prototyping, the developments. And what we also do is like all the calculations to buy the materials, and we purchase the materials. So when we receive the materials, we do all the quality control of those, and we create like little packs to be able to give out to all the knitters. And they are, responsible obviously for taking care of those. And then they also give them, they, work with them in their groups and then give us finished product back. And so, we have like little service orders, and we do like put on paper, the specifications. We give them all this information, what the order is, how much they're being paid. And, they're very clear. We also have a manual that we renew yearly that really clearly outlines the way that we work. And if there's going to be, any sort of deductions on pay or anything, like it's all outlined there. So, if someone loses materials or, doesn't supply them, it's something, it's a cost that the company has. And it's really important for us to tell the leaders, because the leaders also need to be able to communicate that with the people that they work with. And this helps everybody really keep things tight in the supply chain. And usually the way that we work is the first time, is kind of like a warning, like, hey, like really don't let this happen again. We have this discount. You're aware of it. We did talk about it. We really need, your help in this. And it doesn't happen a lot. That's not the idea of things. But at the same time, if we're going to run this on a large scale and be able to protect the work that we give to everybody, we also have to lay out ways to protect the way that we work. Yeah. And, it's only fair for us to communicate that to the leaders so that they're also manning it in the way that they best see fit in their group. So that's kind of the way that we're able to run a relatively tight ship.
But it's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like there's quite a lot of, so the group production leaders are effectively independent entities, but there's quite a lot of shared risk between Green Design Link and those group leaders, because you are the one financing the purchase of the raw materials, right? So there's sort of like built into this relationship, and of course a relationship is always more than a financial transaction. But I mean, I know that in a lot of more like typical manufacturing environments, to finance the purchase of raw materials is actually not something that we see very often, and that is sort of maybe the subtext or one of the things that's underlining or in some ways facilitating this more open communication.
Yeah, honestly, the idea is really for us to be shouldering a lot more of the risk. Being a company, honestly, me as the business owner, also having access to a lot more resources if the worst should happen. I have met several knitters that have worked with us that were also working directly, who have, exported goods and not been paid and gone through really, really tragic experiences. So really the idea is for us to take on that risk with the client and with the materials so that they can really focus on their craft. And honestly, what they do is difficult enough as it is, because they're taking, a lot of people who haven't had, the best access to education or, different sociocultural norms. And they're trying to help these people turn their hobby into a profession. The quality or the standards for quality and everything are just so different. So them having to communicate that and change people's perceptions and train them just in that is a really big feat. And they're also managing their own, mini cash flows based on, the wages that they're paying out or the unit pricing
right.
working on with the different knitters. And, I think that is difficult enough as it is. And then I've seen people grow. I know that it can be hard, but I also think that there's a lot of reward in being able to overcome things that you thought you weren't capable of. And I think that is especially empowering. So yeah, we definitely, focus on them trying to just focus on their craft. We, are not always easy to work with, but we try to, do the best blend possible of what the market is demanding and what we're able to do in a way that really makes it livable for everybody.
Right. And I think this is something I've heard a lot from people who are in sort of like smaller artisanal sustainable fashion, sustainably focused like fashion brands, is that I think on the consumer side, there's often the perception that, oh, it's expensive and people must be getting really rich off of this. But it's actually, I would flip it around and I would say that in a lot of these cases with these sort of smaller brands that are really focused on doing things sustainably, that it's like, it's not so much that, that the owners of those businesses are reaping tons and tons of rewards. It's in fact the opposite. They're assuming all of the risk, right? Which is something that really flips, I think, more typical supplier brand relationships on its head. And I think it's important for consumers to understand that.
Maybe end consumers just don't know how expensive it could be if we do everything more sustainable. I mean, very simple. If we started to calculate the environment cost, then the whole cost or the whole pricing could be very different. Today, environment is usually to be seen as free, but actually how much water we use and how we purify it, how we put it back, electricity, where the electricity comes from, all the land, all the species living on that land, that land is going to be turned into industrial land and so on. All this environmental cost, and it's just a big invisible part. And even we don't talk about this yet. We just talk about, thinking about how to pay the workers more sustainably and more fair. And this is already quite, it's amount of cost. So maybe for end consumers is more to know doing things in a more sustainable way is not cheap. It's expensive somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I mean, in people's defense, I think I just had no idea like how fabric becomes a garment until I actually saw it happen. And it's really hard to envision or imagine what goes on behind the curtain with manufacturing in general, especially for clothing. And people just don't understand. We're used to seeing certain prices. And when you see bigger prices, we just can't understand or fathom the circumstances that would lead to such high pricing. I think it's easier for us. We've seen it, in all honesty. And I think that is kind of like the next step of manufacturing is this whole idea of transparency and really showing people why that happens, like what actually goes behind this, what's going into it, so that they can start to understand how those costs actually build up.
Suddenly I had just a question pop up in my mind. I had the impression that the communication between Green Design Link and the knitters are going through the group leaders, right? So how about the compliance part? I mean, if there's no direct communication between Green Design Link and the knitters, correct me if that is not correct, then how we know clearly about the situation or the status of the knitters?
That's kind of the most difficult part right there. And the way that we've been able to kind of keep it in check to date is obviously certain agreements that we have with our lead knitters, but also whenever somebody's not able to meet dates or they're losing knitters, we know that something's going on. So if somebody's not offering a competitive price, if somebody's not, if they're losing kind of the people, there's always kind of red flags that go up because, there is, I think, quite a lot of knitting demand at this point in Lima. So, there's different ways to be able to contact with them. And then also, of course, having, periodic conversations, seeing the quality of the work, figuring out how they grow their company from, one step to the next. These things kind of tend to come up. But as we grow, that's obviously, there's always going to be new challenges and new areas where we need to improve, new areas that we need to tackle. And so that's definitely one of the things that we're working on.
I think that this model, that sort of more traditional fashion supply chains have a lot that they could maybe take from this model. I mean, that's my personal point of view. And that it's something that Jessie and I have talked about in a number of episodes now, which is how do you sort of give power back to whether it's a factory or in your case, these group leaders, how do you sort of help, make those players in the supply chain accountable instead of trying to, let's say, police them and control them? How do you actually, we're back to this word trust. How do you create a relationship of trust so that you're willing to sort of locate responsibility for social compliance with the people who actually have the ability to shape it and to drive it, as opposed to sort of and taking more of a ground up approach rather than a top down approach. And I want to ask you how you go about identifying your group leaders and how you do recruitment how do you find them?
It's very much word of mouth. So the people that, we work with and we have on our team are very kind of in the knitting circuit. Whenever we're looking, we're able to kind of go through different areas of Lima based on word of mouth and find these people, or even, call on our knitting leaders and ask if, they're able to, increase their capacity by finding more individual knitters.
What you said is just, it reminds me, it takes me back almost verbatim to something that Jessie said maybe in her episode when she was describing her experience working as a merchandiser, and she was describing working with a factory who told her, and this was quite unusual, but informed her as the merchandiser, the representative of the brand, that they were subcontracting.
Yeah, it was quite clean, organized, and there's no abuse of workers' rights or abuse of labor's, no such stories. So I was quite surprised. Yeah.
Right. And and when we were discussing that, one of the conclusions that we came to was that really the biggest determining factor, because you don't want to draw from that lesson all subcontracted facilities are great, there's no problem. I mean, that's not the case. And there are real reasons why these subcontracted facilities are invisible, and therefore why often, in terms of compliance, the story can be, or the picture can be quite grim. But that the biggest sort of determining factor was that this supplier was a supplier who had been carefully selected and was somebody that was, you could trust what they were going to do because their reputation was also on the line, right? And if they were going to subcontract to another facility, you could, in this particular context, you could trust that they were kind of going to vet their partners pretty carefully because if it went wrong, it was their necks that were on the line. And that sort of really resonates, I think, with what you just described, where you're saying there's referral through word of mouth, and that people are kind of known within the community, and that if something goes, people are also part of the communities in which they're working. And so then there's also sort of a social, what's the word? A social
reputation?
Yeah, accountability. Yeah, right. And that this is this is really interesting when you think about social responsibility and ways that you might do social responsibility at scale. Because I think if you were to approach like a larger brand or a more traditional player in the fashion scene, like the first thought would be like, well, this is way too much risk, right? We have to know exactly what's going on. We have to be able to see exactly what's going on. But ultimately, that's not scalable, right? So how do you like establish partnerships in the way that you just described, which really sort of empower people further down the supply chain to take ownership of things like social compliance and social responsibility?
Well, we also have a team of auditors and people who do follow up to production weekly, if not more. We're going out to these places and to the leaders' homes or to the workshops that we're working with in order to get a gauge on quality and also progress for timing. So we work mostly in Lima, which, we want to be able to change because that's one of kind of the historic problems with the country where, Lima is really the place where there's most work opportunity, which forces a lot of people to come here. But for the time being, it's allowed us to really have greater control over what we're doing in terms of quality and timing. So those auditors are always there and, checking on things, seeing the conditions, seeing who's there, seeing what's going on, and have a very direct relationship with, the knitting leaders. The knitting leaders, it's just knitting is kind of a very project-based kind of work. It's not a full-time job where people are in a place and on a payroll and, kind of like, oh, I have to do this or I'm going to lose my job. Maybe a knitter has a death in the family and they need to go, travel to, wherever their home or their relatives are. And then they come back and they start working again. It's kind of take it or leave it. So,
and that's the way it's always kind of been in Peru in terms of like the role of knitting in these communities.
Honestly, that's a great question. And I don't know if I can speak to how it's always been. I only kind of know how it's been for us. But I would venture to say yes. Part of why it's so difficult to work with this group and to do handmade products because the workforce is also so volatile. Knitting isn't really seen like a job. It's like a supplemental income. And when we're talking about hand knitting, right? And oftentimes like, manual machines and everything else, the knitting leader will just call on people whenever there's work because sometimes there's not. And I think knitters in general are used to it being a little bit more seasonal and people can straight up say no. And if people needed something really stable, maybe they're not necessarily in this work area, this niche. And they're doing something a little bit different. Maybe they're in like industrial knitting and they are working at a factory.
But what you've said, I think, just really hits the nail on the head because one of the, I keep saying this, but one of the themes that we've come up again and again is unstable demand. And how do you deal and how do you cope with an industry where unstable demand is inherent to the business of fashion, right? In many senses of the word, from in the sense that, you might design something one season and it's a hit and the next you might not, or, people buy more in certain months than they buy in other months. And, there are ebbs and flows to production. And I think a lot of times within sustainability spaces, we try and cope with that by saying, well, everyone needs to be on permanent contracts and everybody needs to have job security. And I totally agree. Those are things that are really, really, really important. But they're really also hard to achieve in a context where there's unstable demand. And I think what the scenario that you just described really opens up the imagination to conceive of like, how could you cope with unstable demand and sort of production that's up and down in a way that is treats people with dignity and with respect? And maybe that isn't quite what we, necessarily where our head first jumps to when we hear those ideas, like, permanent contract or, whatever. but maybe there is a way for these two things to coexist, and to coexist in a way that is respectful and that, allows workers dignity as well.
I think, knitting here in Peru has always kind of been seasonal and ebbs and flows. So that's something that we've all just taken as a reality. And that we, at least, not like speaking for, us as a company and then also our knitters, we've never really tried to mess with that. So we all understand that that's the nature of knitting, and we haven't tried to take it to a different place. And we've kind of built on that. And what we've tried to do as a company is bring more work to the table so that they are able to have a lot more stability. This is not to say that they are working all the time. There are, going back to ebbs and flows, it's like, and like I worked as a translator for a while. So it reminds me a lot of like my work in translating. So sometimes I'd, have work, and it would, I'd have this project that I have to get in by a certain date, and I would be working maybe like round the clock or, a lot, but then the next few days I had off. And I think that the structure that we have here is probably similar, where, sometimes it's like, run, go. And, we got to get the order out and everything. And it's a lot more work, but then, you have a little bit of a break, and you're like, well, I'll go on vacation. I'm going to go, visit family. And what we try to do, and I think that and this is really one of the most difficult things I think we have as a company, is trying to map out everybody's capacity and keep them as busy as possible without things overlapping, without overburdening, trying to respect as much as possible the work that they want, and seeing where any sort of overflow will go. And what makes this, additionally more complicated is that each group is essentially in charge of a certain style. And we can't always predict what styles are going to have what volume or what date or what order, you know what I mean? So then trying to orchestrate all of that actually becomes extremely difficult. But that's something that certainly beats the alternative. There's a lot of really big corporations out there that just have a no homeworker policy, because they can't, they can't control the conditions. I mean, how can you tell somebody how to have their home, if that's the place where they work? So it's such an important income for such a large population of the earth, that to just write it off because it's difficult or because there's factors you can't control, I personally feel like that's not the right way to go. And that's taking compliance to a level that is excluding so many people who need this work.
Very small question. If I'm personally interested, I have a guess, but I don't know if you guys feel relevant or not. So just thinking, is that the case that usually the group leaders come from the same area or same village or same community with the leaders, knitters? Is that the case? Yeah.
Often. So yes, there's definitely a geographical factor. However, we've definitely found cases where we have groups on the opposite ends of Lima who are losing knitters to each other. This doesn't happen so much anymore. This was kind of, a few years back, but we'd be like, wait a second, like we'd have a certain style that we divided between two groups based on capacity. And we found that, some knitters were going to another group. And that's one of those factors where it was like, okay, wait a second, what are you guys paying your knitters? We need to kind of like,
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And so these are kind of the things that started to happen where we're like, okay, wait a second, we need to, you guys need to work on. So actually the knitters also, talk to each other so that they can make sure that they're not kind of overlapping, and just getting knitters to actually talk to each other and look at each other more as like teammates and colleagues rather than competition was a feat in and of itself. But now, if somebody's overloaded and needs something, they'll usually call on somebody else, and then they help each other in that way. Kind of like the Aini concept in Quechua, where, I think it's today for you, tomorrow for me, where, I'll help you in this chance. And then when I need your help, you chip in. And we've kind of been able to foment that. So, I mean, to answer your question, generally they're close together, but there's also times that they're not. And we also have leaders who are taking on groups in other areas outside of Lima, like in the Andes and other communities, in order to get more capacity.
Okay, I'm interested in this question because I have a guess that how to say that. When there is a blank space that no system has been built up, especially there's no modern factory-based system built up, then what makes people can trust each other and what makes them can work together is sometimes a kind of bond, either from, I call it as natural bond, for instance, from the same families or same villages or same big families like relatives, or sometimes it's sort of a geographic bond, from same villages or same areas, or share some same cultural background, same sort of
Community.
folks, community. So I think that's the key factor for a management like that. To manage artisans over a larger scale, there must be such bond to make the communication much more efficient and to grow more trust, more cooperations. Yeah, it's interesting to hear that. Yeah,
all those factors are definitely at play, and then friendship also plays a really big role. So a lot of times when, if a client comes and we take them, they want to see the knitters, they want to see what's going on. We go and take them and, you can see, you hear in the stories, the knitting leader and the women, they don't do it just for work. There's also, this huge, kinship and kind of like moral support that often goes on in the group where they get together not just to knit and not just to have income, but also to be able to talk to each other about what's going on in life, about their kids. And, what's so important about knitting is it works around their schedule. So, their kids come first. The knitting day is not like any other working schedule where, they're working 9 to 5. They are first and foremost, housekeepers and moms. They're running their household. And then knitting comes second. So they usually take care of the kids in the morning, and then in the afternoons they kind of like get together. But it's this space where they can be in touch on a really human level. And the knitters also talk a lot about how therapeutic knitting is, and that's all over Google. I mean, it's no secret that knitting is really therapeutic, but it's something that we see pop up time and again in the stories about why the knitters knit. Often it's something that they learned when they were young or they learned when they're older. It doesn't matter, but oftentimes it has to do with getting through difficult periods of time in their life. Speaking to what you're saying about compliance and the questions that you have, I think they're really important questions. And I personally don't know the answer about the best way to go about compliance, but I hope that like in 6 months to a year, I do. And that's kind of, I think, the next step for us and the next phase is really to see at least how we approach compliance and if we can gather some better ideas on what that means in the homeworker setting.
So to date, we've already gained fair trade certification through Prom Peru of the Peruvian government. And we've also formed a relationship with the organization Nest, which is doing an amazing job of spearheading homeworking standards for companies like ours. But it can still be hard to understand exactly where we fit, and at times it can feel like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. So this is something that will likely always be a work in progress for us, and we'll have to continually find ways to improve. But then again, that's kind of how everyone should be operating. Working in an informal sector and trying to build out parameters that preserve the flexibility homeworkers need isn't easy, but we're definitely up for the challenge and aim to make continual improvements to how we approach this.
So I think this discussion about social compliance is really interesting, and it begs a lot of questions about what should we take away, because I think there's a lot of different messages that maybe feel conflicting at times. Jessie, what do you think?
Oh, it just reminded me a term that Chinese government love to use it, but not anymore today. But I think that term is perfect to describe what I think right now, which is soft power and hard power. Yeah, it's just all this kind of natural bond between people. Like people are from same village, geographically bonded, or family bonded, like cousins, relatives, and so on. Rules actually has a lot of power comparing to standard procedure, compared to the rules of compliance.
Audits.
Also. Yeah, audits, especially audits. Yeah. So when people grouped together, they naturally will have sort of bonds, and those bonds works better actually when there is compliance conflicts. So it just make me think, what in a place, if the modern production or so-called modern way of living didn't destroy those kind of fabric of society yet, then usually communities can work better. Well, maybe I can't say work better, but communities definitely play a very important role of compliance. And hard power here, I want to mention is usually what we said just now: audits, rules, regulations, all these terms. It can work. It's definitely necessary, very necessary. But somehow there are some gray zones. Something cannot be straightforward. For instance, a manager didn't speak very well, didn't speak nicely to the workers. And I don't know if you can use an audit or use a rules to go against that to force him to change. But however, if there is a soft power, if there is a bond, or if there is a community, the pressure from the community could make the manager change much faster than...
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because maybe one of the reasons that we have such a formal and prescriptive system for social compliance, kind of as we know it today, which is really focused and rooted in accreditation systems or auditing systems, is because more often than not, garment factories are kind of like islands, totally isolated from their typical social and community relationships. I mean, it reminds me in episode 6, we talked to Kim and Kim is Cambodian, and her relationship with the Chinese management and the struggles that the Chinese management had in terms of building positive relationships with the Cambodian staff. And often factory management, not always, but often factory management is not part of the community in which they're working. And workers at the same time also leave their communities behind and move to the city to go and work in the garment factory. So community level accountability is kind of out the window on both sides. And then we look at artisanal production, like what Green Design Link has described, which is working with, over 1,000 knitters who are already knitting. They're a community that already exists. And then kind of we hear, for me, I actually was surprised to hear that Green Design Link was doing audits. But I guess it makes sense because we're trying to impose a similar approach, which is really quite prescriptive and focused on finding, let's call it a way of controlling a Wild West, instead of leveraging the systems of accountability that are already in place. If you came in with working hours, you have to work from 8 to 5, or with maximum 2 hours of overtime, and these totally inflexible schedules, you'd end up working against and maybe even destroying the community life that created it in the first place. How do we create space for imagining other models that focus less on universal one-size-fits-all approaches and more on really leveraging the sort of community bonds and community accountability that are already in place? And that's hard because one size fits all are easier to manage and easier to sort of, especially from a legal perspective, show that you've done your due diligence and that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. But are they really always the best thing for guaranteeing workers' rights? And I think it really depends on context. So I don't have any answers for Green Design Link either, but I hope that
we could see compliance in a more, how to say it more?
Radically reimagine compliance.
Yeah.
And that consumers are ready for it and willing to take it on too, because that's the other challenge, right? Consumers, like, I think there's so much greenwashing, and there's so much like, oh, I'm a sustainable brand, but are you really? And consumers are so skeptical, and understandably and justifiably so. Right.
Yeah,
but that leaves players like Green Design Link in a tough spot, because on the one hand, consumers are getting more and more educated. They're asking to see accreditation. They're asking to see information about policies. They're asking, and consumers have been given a framework for what social compliance looks like from brands, and kind of maybe they expect to see in other contexts too. And
so in that case, maybe end consumers could understand compliance is a live thing, needs to fit the context, not a stiff standard or something, not just a paper or certification.
Yeah, but I think a lot of times too, like maybe the reason for that too is that compliance is within legal, and it's seen as like in bigger brands, often compliance departments, social compliance departments are housed within legal, and they're seen as a way to sort of do due diligence, so that like if something should happen in the supply chain, if there's a sweatshop expose or an expose of human rights abuses or whatever it might be, that the brand can then say, well, you know, we've been, I mean, you saw it with Rana Plaza, right? We've been doing our compliance audits. We've been following our procedures. We've been checking the facilities that we work with. And, therefore, like, we're not responsible, and the problem lies somewhere else. So it's almost even, I think, used as a tool to facilitate
shedding responsibilities to the other sides. Yeah.
And then like you come in in an example like Green Design Link, which from the get-go has been set up and structured in a completely different way. So it's a bit of a catch-22. On that note, we'll have to come back to you in 6 months to a year and have this conversation again and see where we're at.
Thank you for listening to Manufactured.
To learn more about our guests and the issues we've chatted about today, check out our website, manufacturedpodcast.com, or find us on Instagram at manufactured_podcast.
We'd also love to hear your stories and what you think. Collecting with listeners is the most rewarding part of what we do, so please don't be shy. Leave comments on Instagram or connect with us privately through our website.
To be the first to find out about new episodes, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd also love it if you left us a review. Leaving a review helps other people find our show, and we'd love your help with that.
Thanks for listening, and see you next week.